There was a big stack of plastic. It was all black plastic up in the corner by the front of the house near the fireplace. I remember that. So he took the hammer from them and bludgeoned both of them. And then he stuffed them underneath the house in that plastic. I know he did it. So when I got out, I told the person there's some kind of carcasses under there up at the front of the house.
You better be watching. You better be watching in the dark. You better be watching.
Mr. Pearson invited me into the house, and I thought for a second, knowing what I know now, I could have been the fourth bag under the house.
I was the main witness. I had to tell them about everything that I found and that I felt that they were under the house. And stared me down, and I just looked right back at him.
I'm Sonya Paz.
And I'm Mark Kospchik.
And we are your host of Investigated.
This podcast describes scenes of true crime details and may not be suitable for all listeners. Please be advised.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to episode 7 of Investigated. Got my great co-host, Mark, here. How you doing?
Good. How are you again, Sonya? We had a great episode 6, I think. We had a lot of inquiries of what's going on. And you had a busy week talking to a lot of people that have all new information for our next episodes.
I do. So much. This is just I don't want to call it a can of worms because it's not a can of worms, but it's definitely peeling back the layers of everything and the story just really coming together with new information. Gosh, and I'm not exaggerating, almost daily is something new, something interesting. As we promised to our listeners that we would talk about the interviews from George Kennedy and Monty Macer. We'll do that really quick. And then we're going to be bringing in another couple of recorded interviews from, I'm going to call them bonus interviews because we are going to be listening from Jerry Sand, who was the termite inspector who found the Pearson women under the house, and also another termite inspector, actually my son Ryan, who is a state certified termite inspector, and I had questions for him, and he's going to answer those questions. We value our listeners so much. So when we do get a question, we want to make sure that we can address it right away. So we're going to just jump into answering a couple quick questions and then give you some details, and then we'll move right on in and discuss our interviews. I love to hear information about people who are listening and that they have listened to the critical details to where maybe something stands out to them that we might have not gone into detail about. So we're just going to touch on that for just a second.
Sounds great.
Awesome. So the subject of the golf courses that we spoke about in our early episodes was kind of mentioned. I had a question from a listener named Patricia and one from Diana, and it was about the mention in the article describing the Saratoga Country Club facts. And of course, I wasn't there, you weren't there, but we are going off of articles that were written. And this article specifically mentioned that Pearson family were members of the Saratoga Country Club in Saratoga, California. The question from Patricia was, do you know when they joined the country club? Because it was very different back then. And I don't think they had the clubhouse at that time. I reached out to a couple of contacts of people that I know who might have had that answer to the question. So Diana's question was pretty much the same. She knows that the clubhouse was built in the early 70s, and it wasn't part of the golf course and the tennis and swimming at the time. But she just wanted to just clarify because, I do love that people are listening and that they want to know these kind of things. So I did go and I checked it out. Although we can't find out for sure if they were members because that's private information, but I had a theory about it.
And what was it?
And what was my theory? So my theory was that there is another golf course very near to where they lived on Woodham's Road in Santa Clara. I looked on the map. It's about 2 miles away from Woodham's Road to this Prune Ridge golf course, which was built in 1967. And we know that Pearson moved from Oregon to Santa Clara in 1967. And I think that would have been a really interesting draw for him. Something that thought, hey, here's this place that I'm moving to for this new job. And there's a golf course, a brand new one, just down the street about 2 miles.
They were probably looking for members since it was new, and probably you could get in for fairly cheaper than normal rates for a country club.
I thought so too. Another thing too, that golf course, now I've heard 2 stories. I've heard that it was once an 18-hole course, and in the mid-'80s, that whole course kind of went through a revamp, and they had built condominiums on the property. So it went from possibly an 18-hole course down to 9, but some people say, or the, Santa Clarians that I've talked to said it was never an 18-hole course. It was always a 9 course, but the course was longer. And so they had to, redo the entire architecture of the course at that time. So that's kind of interesting. The other thing that makes me think that the reporter might have, and I never want to discredit a reporter, but from what I'm hearing, this kind of just made me think that it would have been more reasonable and more affordable to join Prune Ridge versus Saratoga. And at the time, there was a very fancy restaurant called the Bond House that was the main restaurant at the Prune Ridge Golf Course. And they had the sign up there on the corner of Prune Ridge Avenue and San Tomas Expressway for decades, even though the restaurant was no longer there since probably the late 80s. The Bond House sign, and where it said lobster, prime rib, cocktails, that stood there on that property for decades. And it was only in the last few years that they finally, after all that time, probably 40 years, nearly 40 years, had finally updated that sign to where it says something else. So that's kind of interesting.
So I have a question for you.
Sure.
Because I know that your dad played golf with him. Where did your dad usually play golf?
My dad actually would go to Sunken Gardens, which was on Wolf Road near El Camino in Sunnyvale. He went there a lot. I think the reason he went there was that he was working in Sunnyvale at the time, so that would have been an easy way to just sort of stop by there either before work or most likely after work for a, twilight golf in the evening and just do a quick 9 holes over there. Yeah, but he also went to Prune Ridge. And of course, there was Blackberry Farms. There was a few other smaller 9-hole golf courses in the area as well.
Right. So Pearson could have played all those golf courses since they were kind of all in the area, but may have been a member of one of the country clubs as well.
Right. And there were some other long-standing older golf courses out in the San Jose area as well toward the hills. So, and one thing I want to mention is that I also have an article. Pearson wasn't the only one that was really avid and really great at golf. Pauline, his wife, was quite the great golfer as well, because in a little article that we found in 1966, there was a snippet basically that at the McNary Golf Course in Oregon, it says Mrs. Pauline Pearson used a driver to ace the 129-yard 4-hole at McNary Golf Club Saturday evening. Mrs. Pearson's playing partner at the time was her husband, Jim Pearson. So she was pretty good at it. And knowing what we know, that probably just torqued his shorts.
Probably that she got a hole-in-one and he never even came close.
Right. So the family playing golf together, I think was one of the things that they did. And so I thought that was really interesting and good for Pauline, getting a 129-yard hole-in-one. That's quite an achievement.
Right on.
Awesome. Let's start in on those interviews. Let's go ahead and start off with George's interview. What are your thoughts about it?
I actually thought both interviews were fantastic. And again, it just seems like everyone we talk to, even though this case is so old, has a recollection of the events of whatever parts they played in this case to be fantastic. George was, like you said, he was slow and go, but the facts he gave and what he remembered were fantastic. And then Detective Sergeant Macer seems like this case was yesterday for him, and I thought that was a great interview as well.
The thing in talking with George is that when I had asked him the part about what stands out in your mind about the case, namely the thing about the termite inspector, and you can hear it from his voice that he was truly just really disenchanted at the fact that other termite inspectors had inspected the home, and it wasn't until Jerry had come along to find the findings. The other thing was about the Eichler home. And for those of our listeners who are not in the area where we live, an Eichler home is a home that's built on a slab. The design of the home is something where you would have the outside and the inside sort of one of the same. They're homes that have big panes of glass that act as walls and beam ceilings and radiant heating through the floor. It was sort of the thing about, bring the inside outdoors and bring the outdoors inside kind of feeling mid-century modern. I grew up in one of those homes in Santa Clara, and it was pretty nice to have, it's almost like you were in your own little secluded area. And those homes don't have typically a crawl space, and that had stuck out in his mind as well. And of course, we're all talking about the boy in Mississippi who saw Pearson's face on the poster.
Right. That seems to be accumulated effort as far as a response to that. This whole thing would have never gotten rolling if it wasn't for that little boy who just, tugged on his parents and said, "Hey, I think I know this guy."
Right.
I liked how methodical his conversation was with you. It was like he was taking you through everything that he remembered as far as during trial. I also thought what was really interesting was his take on how Pearson folded right away after he got caught up in a lie on cross-examination, and that after that he just gave up.
And he said he just seemed like a pathetic figure. And I know that you and I had talked about the questions I would be asking him prior to our interview. And your question to me was, ask him who was his best witness. And his answer was Pearson himself, because like you said, he cracked and let that facade drop.
Right. And DAs usually will say that, actually. If the defendant testifies and they're able to get his goat, so to speak, and get them to misstep on the stand, they will say that their best witness was the defendant. The other thing I thought was very poignant was George saying that he actually thought that Pearson was somewhat remorseful, but again, didn't take it all the way to the bank during his testimony, nor in his letter to the judge. And I thought that was pretty interesting, that actually someone did think that he was a little bit remorseful.
Right. One thing that I've thought a lot about since he and I spoke was that, especially since he said that he had let his facade drop and he just sort of gave up, I think Pearson met his match with George. I think Pearson was just always so persuasive and cunning and manipulative that he got anyone to believe anything that he said. And here's George that came along and I guess just mulled him over and got him to, state the facts. And he got somebody that was assertive and was onto his game. And I think that in itself brought him to, throw the cards in or just give up.
Right. I thought he also was pretty professional when he said that Christensen, the defense attorney, the public defender for Pearson, did a great job and wouldn't have messed around putting on basically cockamamie defenses, that he basically went straight to the issues that they had and put those on and let the dice roll to where they were going to finish.
Right. Do you think it was strange that there was no other witnesses for Pearson in that trial? Because I know if they would have had them, they would have brought them in. But I guess who would have been everyone was against him, I guess, at that point.
I think if Pearson was to bring in witnesses, I think he may have brought in character witnesses. The problem with that is everyone who could have been a character witness at that point, he had screwed. I actually think what the defense did was pretty good, which was just put him on and let the other witnesses testify from the DA's perspective and see where the cards may fall. I do think, like George did, that he probably knew the gig was up when trial started and probably after the DA's case was put on.
Well, if you also remember Mary Winget, she had testified, and when I had interviewed her, because I had asked her, what, did he look at you? She said, yeah, he tried to stare me down. And she said, and I stared down right back at him. And I don't think a lot of people stood up to him in his life or during this con or during this charade he was playing.
Yeah, I think he thought he was the front man all the time and everything went his way, even though nothing really went his way.
The fact that the FBI goes into the store and he only says one time, no, I'm not James Pearson. And they suggest he go and get his prints down at the station. And he automatically says, it's me, I did it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think
that's bizarre.
Well, I think you're right. I think when he meets his match with other people, then he folds very quickly, like he did with the FBI agent O'Neill and like he did with George when he was in cross-examination.
And of course, we also had my interview with Monty Macer, which was truly delightful. And it's just amazing to me, too, that his memory on the state of affairs of what happened way back then was pretty amazing.
Yeah, I felt that his insight as the detective on the case was obviously really good, and how he put it into perspective as far as how things worked back then in the 70s and how things work now, how police work, I think, back then was much more difficult than it is now. And they basically, at that point, when no one had heard from the Pearsons and everybody thought, oh, this was just, they had moved and everything was okay. And that it wasn't. You had to communicate via sending letters or teletype with the police agencies. That's the only way that they communicated, and how you needed a surprise tip to clean out a good case. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yes. And one thing that I had heard many, many years ago was the fact that they would use the newspapers to work with the law enforcement using things like teletype machines and faxes before they were a consumer item back in the day. Of course, things now is you have a lot of crowd sourcing information. People have a phone and you can put a photo up and say, okay, internet, help me out here. This guy or this person, this woman was found in such and such city and state, and it was a hit and run. And do you recognize this car? Does this man look familiar to you? And people will come together to help solve a lot of this stuff. And as much as that would have been amazing back then, it wasn't the case. So that's why it took nearly 10 years to find him and catch up with him. But they did.
Yeah, when social media now, it's like everyone that has a phone becomes a investigative reporter or a reporter out in the field, because they can just pull out their phone and go videotape something, take snapshots, and it can get posted within seconds of everything happening, which was not the case back then.
No, shows my age. Shows your age.
Shows mine too, like you said.
I just wanted to give a shout out to the heroes. I think the whole podcast is a giant shout out to everybody and folks that have come forward and have been receptive to help with filling in the blanks on a lot of this story and a lot of this coverage that we're doing.
Absolutely. And as you found out, and from this week, we still have a lot more to cover with actually now the people that Pearson was involved with personally and their stories now after we've finished with the trial.
Through my research and diligent follow-up, I was able to reach Jerry Sand. He is the termite inspector who had found the Pearson ladies under the house. We spent a few moments on the phone talking, and before we started our interview, Jerry had a lot of questions for me at the beginning of how I was involved in the case and what was my interest in it. So we had spent a good time talking about that. I gave him all of what I knew, pretty much in a nutshell, and then had asked him just some basic questions on what his experience was finding them, some information about the layout of the house, and some really good information. And we'll just jump right into that. And then we will have my conversation with Ryan, who is a termite inspector here in this day and age today. And he will talk about sort of his experiences and how things might have changed since then. And we will learn a lot from both of these individuals. And I'm really excited about it.
Sounds excellent. Can't wait to hear all that.
All right. So without any further ado, here's my interview with Jerry Sand. Hi, Jerry. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. As we had discussed in great length, I wanted to just touch base with you and for the podcast and have our listeners hear from you directly about what your experiences were when you found the bodies under the home on Claremont Avenue in Santa Clara, and just a little bit about what you had found and how you felt about that and who were you with at the time and just all those details.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
That was a strange thing. It was either the homeowner or the realtor that waited outside for me at the access, because an outside access to the house wasn't in a closet. It was outside in the back. I knew I had carcasses involved.
You're right.
But I didn't know what they were because there was a big stack of plastic. It was all black plastic up in the corner by the front of the house near the fireplace. I remember that. So what I did was I probed it to see what was in it, and that's when I saw they were full of dead maggots, fluid, and little bones. So I thought, somebody took their animals and stuck them under. Why would they do that? So when I got out, I told the person, whoever it was at the time, that there's some kind of carcasses under there up at the front of the house. So he called the authorities, and they came and checked it out and found out they had the 3 bodies under there. They tracked me down later in the day. I was doing inspections, and they questioned me at the time what I saw. So,
yikes. Yeah,
it was quite an experience back then. I was just starting to. I hadn't been inspecting maybe a year or so at the time.
Did you rethink? Oh my gosh, what did I get myself into?
Yeah. Well, luckily, I think I would have freaked out if I don't. My thought didn't go to bodies when I saw that. I think because it's not unusual to find animal carcasses under houses. Cats or dogs. I mean, there's strange things you see under houses.
Oh, that's terrible.
That just happened to be one that, it'll stick with me the rest of my life. It wasn't as shocking because I didn't know what it was at the time. If I had, it would have been a different thought.
In some of the press, it stated that you had reached out, and this could be just all fluff on the news media part, but that you had reached out and pulled the bag and a skull fell out of the bag and that you kind of hightailed it out of there. But you're saying that
No.
Yeah, that's.
No, we probe under the houses for damage and whatever, but I use a screwdriver because we look for termite damage. You just poke wood and sometimes it's hollow and the termites have eaten it. So that's what we're checking for. And when I saw the plastic bag, it was just curiosity. What the heck? They've got all this plastic, and I just stuck my screwdriver in it, and that's when I saw the dead maggots, the fluid, and little bones. I say that's all I needed to see. I finished my inspection, went out, and told whoever was there, it was either the realtor or the owner, that they had a big plastic mess down there with bones and stuff, and I said they should have that checked out. I have no idea what was in it. So. Wow. Then I heard later on in the day what they found. They caught up with me in my inspections sometime that day and questioned me on the phone. I never met with anybody to talk about it.
Okay. So they just talked to you on the phone. Okay.
Yeah, that was it.
And
I was never called again for anything. I mean, what I read in the paper, they had information in the paper with what I'd found and all that. But as far as conversations with the authorities, that was the extent of it.
well, I'll give you a little kudos here that I actually spoke to George Kennedy, was the prosecutor for the case, and I asked him what kind of stands out as being one of the most interesting things about the case, and he said that two things. One was anytime he hears the word termite or inspection or sees an ad somewhere about, pest control, he automatically thinks about the Pearson case. And
yeah, sure.
Kennedy told me was that he commended you on your thoroughness because the house had been sold a couple of times within that 4.5-year period and had termite inspections done, but they never saw anything, or maybe they just didn't do a thorough enough job to have completely assessed that certain area of that under the house.
Yeah, no, it blocked off the whole corner of the house. That was a bunch of black plastic just piled up in there is what it was. And I always thought it was kind of strange, all this black plastic, and that's why I got curious to see what was in it. And my curiosity showed me that wasn't anything that I really wanted to see. So,
wow.
And if I'd known there were bodies at the time, and when I came out, I would have been a little leery of a person standing outside waiting for me, just because if they knew what was under there.
Oh.
And I had no idea at the time, and obviously they didn't either, because they called the authorities after I told them what I found.
Right.
And that's when they came out and found what they did.
Wow. You clarified a lot, so I really appreciate that.
Yeah, that's the stories get kind of, they get out of whack. More that's passed on from one person to the next or whatever.
Right.
I know what I saw and what I did.
Right, yeah. But I think it's interesting that's, you found it, you reported it, they called you, and that's all you heard.
Yeah, that was it. I had the one conversation with them is what I did,
So let me just ask you a logistical question. I know that you had said that you had gone in through the little crawl space from the outside. Was that like to the back of the house? Was it like this little door?
Yeah, it was the back of the house, and the bodies were at the front of the house.
Okay.
He drugged them all the way, I believe it was right around the fireplace area. He had drugged those all the way from the back of the house to the front of the house. Plenty of room to crawl under them. Most of these houses are. We got room to crawl.
Yeah.
The real tight ones are different. There's some that weren't excavated very well, but most of them have adequate crawl space to get around. Oh. You have to contend with heater ducts and plumbing pipes and sewer lines. I think the house was vacant when I just inspected it. The only access I found was at the back of the house. And whoever met me there was it the realtor or the owner at that time? That's where they pointed me to. That's where I go under. So that's where I went.
The distance from that back to I did see that the fireplace was in that front room. So that was, what, about 20 feet or something, maybe?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I appreciate your clearing that up and taking the time to talk to me about this.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All righty. Take care.
You bet.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So, Mark, that was a great interview, and Jerry was amazing. As you know, he was in his 80s. And again, another person here with a great memory who still remembers this case to this day. And he sounded great.
He was good as well. I keep saying that everyone that we talk to has been great and great memories, but it just falls into place when we talk to these people that they remember all these things.
Right.
And can you imagine being, an inspector who's only been doing it for a year, and you do your job, you do it thoroughly, you notice that there's something weird underneath the house, and you let the owners know, or the real estate agent or whoever had acquired his services, and then those people end up contacting the police, and then that same day you get a call from the police going, by the way, do you know that those were human remains that you found? Because I'm assuming, like he said, that he thought they were animal remains and that they needed to be cleared out of there.
Right. So in my eyes, if it hadn't been for him, you and I have spoke about this, it could have been decades. They may never have found them ever. So big, giant kudos to Jerry Sand for his thoroughness and his efforts, and feel very grateful for that. And I let him know that as well.
And just a person who's actually doing their job, not some of the other termite.
Yahoos.
Yeah, I was going to say. Not like some of the other inspectors who went through the house and just put their chalk marks on and left. This guy actually did his job and then ended up finding the bodies.
So based on little knowledge that I personally have of termite inspections and home inspections, I thought I wanted to ask more information on how the whole process works, why is it done this way, and what is the protocol in doing these inspections. And what better person to ask than my son, Ryan, who happens to be a state certified termite inspector and does home inspections as well. And he agreed to be on the podcast with us. And he is also a listener. So he was very excited and is going to give us more information on how this whole process works. So let's join Ryan on our interview. Ryan, welcome to the Investigative Podcast Show today. How are you?
Good. Thank you for having me. This is going to be quite a journey as I've been following the podcast myself.
Awesome. Gotta love when family is supporting family. As from everything that I have told you and everything that you have heard on the podcast so far, I wanted to know a little bit about how the whole thing with these termite inspections work. It's evident, and as we already know, is there were a couple of times the house sold between the years of 1969 and 1974. And there was a couple of home inspections that were done where the termite inspectors sort of signed off on the home being inspected. But we know now that was not the case. And it wasn't until Jerry Sand had found the bodies of Marianne, Paula, and Pauline in March of 1974 that we realized what was happening and what was going on in the house. So can you just take us through a little bit about what is the typical protocol in your job, what you do in your profession as a termite inspector, on how that all works?
Yeah, so essentially, to make it really simple, and I will say it with certainty, termite inspectors can be a hit and a miss with them. That's why it's always kind of good to get a second quote, as they say, right? So in my field, you kind of learn the different types of houses, the different types of styles. You get familiar with what houses do and don't have crawl spaces or attics, sub areas, stuff like that. From what I remember in that general area of homes, I do know that those Eichler style of homes, they typically don't have crawl spaces. They're usually a slab floor. And I know in some cases, and it's very rare, but it's more when a house is either on a specific type of hill, or if the foundation is in general like more on a slant, they are required to have a crawl space. So sometimes some houses that are more custom, there'll be a crawl space in one of these Eichler style homes. So from my perspective, you run into different types of inspectors or inspections. Sometimes not everyone's the best at their jobs. And there's a reason why we have the agriculture department part of the inspections. When we go and do these things, some inspectors sometimes, and I can't speak for back then, but from my experience, a lot of the people, sometimes they don't want to do their crawls, or sometimes they don't want to necessarily kind of take shortcuts here and there. And I believe you said at the time he had just started doing inspections. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, he had just been in that role for about 6 months.
Yeah, so that sounds about normal. They say in the inspection world, how many crawls can we get out of that guy, right? Like a home inspector in general, there is a slightly high turnover rate because it's very physically demanding. You have to army crawl underneath these houses, and the newer guys are a lot more hungry because they want to find as many things as they can, as they're supposed to by requirement. So
Right.
when I said, for instance, the agriculture department, they get involved with certain things. For instance, if the agriculture was said, if there's a conflicting inspection, if someone's completely clearly not showing a lot of things up to code that another inspector found, that person can lose their job. And it is very interesting because when you're underneath a house, it's an army crawl. It's not an easy job. So what he had found, in all honesty, like every inspector's worst nightmare. I've been doing my job for 6.5 years, and I always do my crawls because my job will know if I do or not, because we have to chalk every corner. I've found very interesting things under homes. I mean, I've gone everything from like I found anything from notes in tin cans from like ex-girlfriends to the owner that the owner didn't even know about. I've found old baseball cards, Topps cards, all sorts of different things. And I bring it to the customers. Hey, look, I found these things. And it's always a funny conversation. Whenever I go down there, there's always the joke like, hey, if you find any dead bodies or if you find a briefcase of $1 million, please let me know. It's like, yeah, it's the first thing I'm going to do. But, for the most part, in his situation, I mean, he's a new inspector, so he's 100% going to do his job to the fullest because it is what it is. And sometimes in this field, you get a hit or a miss. That's why it's always good to get like second quotes and second opinions. But for the most part, I mean, I've had my fair share of run-ins where, and this is kind of a little bit more detailed, but I've been underneath houses where you come across a deceased cat or an animal down there, and every once in a while you'll come across something like that because there'll be a broken vent and cats go underneath, or an animal will go underneath because they want shelter during rain. And then people start hearing noises underneath their house and they think it's a rodent or some kind of animal, and they end up boarding up the holes. And it's a sad story, but sometimes people's pets, they get stuck underneath and they don't know about it for so long. And it's a very sad outcome. And I see that, but never in my, wildest imagination, I've never come across something that guy found. But like I said, there's a high turnover rate for a reason. There's a lot of things down there that can really scare someone.
And what do you wear when you go down into the spaces?
So part of my licensing requires us to be wearing PPE, which stands for protective personal equipment. So for one, we are required to wear 2 layers of a crawl suit. One's usually like a plastic throwaway one, and then we put a more thicker cotton style, like double cotton. I don't know the exact material, but it's like a big clothing overall, like what you see mechanics wear, those big one-piece coveralls. And we wear those with like double layer rubber gloves. And you have to be wearing a respirator, usually like a headlamp of some sort. It's always kind of helpful. Then steel toe boots, things like that. And so basically there's a lot of gross things underneath there. And for instance, we are supposed to check out for plumbing leaks and other things like that and notate that. It's supposed to cover our entire body so that we don't get sick.
Right. And when you say you got to chalk all corners, what does that mean?
Oh, so for instance, in most industries now, it's like a regular thing where if I chalk a corner, it means that I made it to that corner. And in a lot of cases, I'll know if another inspector does their job or not, because I'll know like he crawled there, because you have to physically, chalk with like a kid's chalk. You chalk the date of your company and that they made it there. It's just good for good practice in general, because if I don't do my job and say, for instance, we go back a couple years later to check on things that have been treated, my manager or whoever goes down there, they'll know if I did my job.
Right.
So,
and so do you put like a special number, or is there a certain type of a symbol or something?
Yeah, just
to identify you to the others?
Yeah, basically like a date with the initials of a company in general. If I find something that's an old infestation of something or an old fungus-based area or something, I'll put like the date number, like 2023, 2024 next to it, so that has been identified at that time. But I feel bad for that guy, because if he found what he found underneath, it's scary, because being that close to something, like you have to army crawl, and underneath Eichler homes, they're not like a normal crawl space. Like they're really tight. So him having to go there and then come back, that's just in general, that's a really, really gruesome thought. Holy moly. Right.
Well, aside from that, Pearson, who had to maneuver 3 of the ladies to all the way from the crawl space, which would have been, if he had gone through the crawl space through the bedroom floor, then he probably would have been about 20 feet or so of taking each body and maneuvering them through the crawl space underneath the house, positioning them next to the chimney near the front of the house, and doing that 3 times. And then on top of that, they were stacked upon one another. And I mean, we're anticipating that could have taken him 7 or 8 hours to do. It was not an easy job. And I mean, it's hard for me to talk about my friends in this capacity, but the reality is that he went to a lot of effort to hide them. And I know in speaking with you, I've talked to you and you've told me things about stuff you found underneath houses and animals and games and cards and letters and all that different kind of thing. So I think I even asked you when you first started the job, be careful, Ryan, you might find something gruesome under there.
Yeah, I've had some run-ins before where it's like you go in and it's like I'm already out because it's like, nope, not today, not this house. There's times where it's just some houses just have your number. Either they're too small, too big. Some people that own homes, they don't even understand it. Like they think that you're an invincible person. Like you're the guy, right? You're the guy that goes and does it. And it can be hard. Every time I have to go underneath, I always have to take a deep breath, like in terms of more for my emotional mindset versus, I mean, I've seen grown men whimper in their boots. And I'm not kidding you, like 6'3", 6'5" guys, they go underneath and they come out and they're like, nope, this job's not for me.
Is it because they're too big and the space is too small and it's just not a match? So do they get somebody that's smaller framed to do those jobs? Or do you just kind of chalk it up to, no pun intended, do you just sort of chalk it up to this is not for us today and the company just declines that work?
It's a couple of things. It's like the mental capacity to be underneath, the claustrophobia. I would say I'm pretty fearless, right? I mean, you kind of have to be. I've run into my fair share. Like I've been close to like rattlesnakes. I've been bitten by black widows, things like that. And like, I'm not afraid of that. It's just sometimes some homes, are just, just have your number. Like either it's inaccessible or the amount of cobwebs that are down there that you have to kind of army crawl through it and have to go through. Some homes are just really old. I've been in homes that they were more cleaner underneath the house than they were inside the house.
Well, one of the things that I think I asked you a few weeks back was that I thought it was really interesting and strange that this specific house had two crawl spaces, one accessible from the outside and one that was accessible, of course, from the inside. And in California, most of these crawl spaces are located in the bedroom closet. So that, I know that when I owned my first home, I thought, well, what's this thing? I lifted up the board and thought, yeah, I'm not going to go in there. But you had told me that sometimes there's homes with multiple crawl spaces.
It's not completely abnormal. Like actually a lot more common than people would think. Either houses get added on to, there's additions to it. The code has to be essentially that there has to be an accessible area in case you need to have something worked on. Another thing that I wanted to bring up was when home inspections are done, I'm the person that they go through when selling a home. This is kind of more back towards like the agricultural department and stuff like that. When you sell a home, you have to get a Section 1 done. It's like selling a car almost. Like you can't really sell as is. In the state of California, it's really particular about these type of rules where you have to make sure that everything is up to code, rather it be water damage in some areas, plumbing leaks. It doesn't matter. Like you have to get these things done. And so from an inspector standpoint, that's a legal document that you are creating for a home to be sold. So when I'm doing these or anyone's doing these types of things, you have to get this Section 1 done. And because he did his job correctly, that's, I guess, how they found what they had found. I've been to homes in Menlo Park or Palo Alto, and they're on like different levels of a hill, right? And so the house has different additions with different foundations, and it has multiple crawl spaces and stuff like that. Sometimes homes have an outdoor as well as an addition made to the inside. So I'll go from A to B on a home. I'll start in the inside and I'll end up exiting on the outside, which is kind of funny.
One last question I have for you is people that haven't sold homes in California and they might live in different states, Ohio or Michigan or whatever, that might not have this type of thing. I've had listeners say, well, what's the deal with these termite inspections that need to be done in California? Can you explain a little bit about how that is and maybe when did that start?
We just live in an area where it's more common for termites to come around and to eat based on the hot weather. There's different types of bugs that infest homes during certain weathers. For instance, San Francisco, Santa Cruz areas, I would say is more prone to like wood-boring beetles, which is a type of beetle that feeds upon damp wood. There's also damp wood termites, which they also feed upon wet-based damp wood, kind of hence the name. There's drywood termites, where drywood is more of the sense of like they don't need a lot of water resources or anything like that. They just need a hot, dry form of wood and environment. Keep in mind, redwood doesn't really always apply to a lot of these. Certain woods they can't digest. And then there's subterraneans, which is probably the most common form of termite around because they live in the soil and they actually burrow mounds of mud tubes onto the home, kind of like a vine.
Interesting.
And not every state is required to do these things. Like I said, California is a lot more strict on a lot of their home policies and rules. At the same time, it's a good thing to have in a state because one, it creates more jobs, and two, termites are everywhere. Like they're in every home for the most part. It's just another form of maintenance. It's like your teeth, right? You need to brush your teeth or you're going to have cavities. You need to keep up on your home maintenance because you're going to have these types of issues. So it's also good because to have inspections because of situations like this, what this podcast is based around. You never know necessarily. It's always good to be very familiarized with your whole home because you never know. You might find something underneath the house that you may not be comfortable with.
Right. Gosh, thank you so much for coming on today and explaining this. It really helps answer a lot of questions. And of course, I knew I can rely on you, and it's always good to talk to you.
Well, I appreciate you having me on board. And if you ever have any more questions, feel free to ask away.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan, so much.
Take care.
All right, take care. So based on the layout of the home in Santa Clara on Claremont, and from what Jerry Sand had told us, I did a little bit of research and I found a similar house. I know a lot of people in Santa Clara, so I was able to kind of get a little bit more information on how that house was laid out. And so I did create a little draft of the layout and where the bodies were and where the two crawl spaces were. So if you look on our website, investigatedpod.com, you'll see that in the show notes for today's episode, I put a link to that diagram of the house that shows roughly about how many feet it was from the exterior of the house to where the bodies were piled up, and also a diagram in there about where the distance was from the closet crawl space to where the bodies were stored. And that just will give you a little bit of a visual so that you can sort of imagine. Because I don't know, Mark, I'm visual. Aren't you kind of visual getting this stuff?
Absolutely. Well, and the diagram points out that whichever path he chose to move the bodies out of the house, whether it was the interior or the exterior way to get to the crawl space, it's like you measured 22 feet to 40 feet. That's still a haul to get those bodies under the house. So that's why the diagram's really good.
And it kind of also just coincides with other homes in the area. And that's how I sort of came up with that equation. I don't know if those closets were exactly in where I had indicated on there, but I'm just basically, it's just, we're talking just a few feet difference. So I think that will really give everyone an idea of how it was.
Absolutely.
And like you said in our previous episode, it didn't take him an hour to do this. It took him several hours to be able to move all of the everything down below.
So again, Sonya, it's amazing to me how, times have changed, where you have an inspector who we talked to that's 80 years old now, and how things have changed, protocols changed, and how you're actually supposed to do an inspection now versus 45 years ago.
But the whole recipe is the same. I mean, as Ryan had mentioned, he does the whole crawling under the house. Crawl spaces in 1974 are roughly the same depth as they are now. I mean, if homes even have that now, they're just built differently.
Well, and I would assume, because he said that most crawl spaces are about the same depth, that's obviously part of the building code that we have here in the United States, that if you're going to have a crawl space, it has to be a certain depth. And so, like I was saying, some things have changed and some things haven't.
I found it kind of concerning, knowing what I know now, is that he gets people telling him all the time, hey, if you find a dead body under the house, let me know. And
jokingly,
but he often thinks about that. And of course, I know the first person he would call if he was to find that, it would be me. Anyway, many thanks to Jerry San and to Ryan for their amazing time that they spent with us to talk to us about their profession and what happened in Santa Clara in 1974. And I think this has been a great episode today. Look forward to seeing you next week, Mark, and we'll be back with more great information.
Okay, Sonya, have a great day. See you next time, where we're going to be listening to episode 8 on Investigated.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to follow Investigated on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also visit our website at investigatedpod.com to learn more about your hosts, Sonya Paz and Marek Kaspchik. Follow us on social media and connect with us. Investigated is written, edited, and hosted by me, Sonya Paz, with story input and advisement from Marek Kaspchik. And many thanks to the research of criminologist Clark Williams and to Allison Betts Goldman for her contributions to this story. If you'd like to support our show, visit our website. And if you'd like to give us a 5-star review on Apple iTunes, we would always appreciate that, because extra podcast love is amazing. It also helps us get more visibility from fabulous listeners like you. Thanks again, and see you next time.